Hi guys, and welcome back to Nine Talks Boxing. A longer overdue return. I'd just like to apologise for a couple of things beforehand before we get started. Firstly, I'd like to apologise for any background noise you may hear because it's absolutely stuffy in here right now. I, I've got the fan on, so you'll probably hear that. And also, obviously, I'd like to apologise for not posting or anything for a long time. It's been quite a hectic month, so um, it's good to get back at it. But Theus is in the comments, fighting out narratives, saying hi, Nang, and hello. And yeah, no, it's good to be back because I enjoy doing this. Um, enjoy doing this a lot. Um, so yeah, it's good to be back. It's good to kind of talk about this card and also some other action that we got on this weekend. But yeah, let's get into it. So, of course, the big one everyone's talking about this weekend, literally coming up. I think the card starts in around an hour or so from now. But yeah, Crawford and Madrimov. Um, of course, it's being promoted by Turkey Al Sheikh. But it's the first one that's out of Saudi Arabia. So they've got a couple of promotions together on this card, but it's not happening in Saudi Arabia. So that's going to be interesting because we're going to have a similar kind of setup in um, well later this year because we've got Joshua versus Dubois. Um, but no, this card is pretty interesting and it's got a few different scenarios for the winners and things like that. Um, so like, yeah. Now I don't remember the bout order, so I'm just going to go into the different fights, one by one. And it might not be in the order that you expect, but I'll try to keep it quite uniform. But the first one I'm going to talk about is Andy Cruz. Andy Cruz is fighting, and he's fighting a pretty good opponent in Antonio Moran. I don't expect Moran to win this fight, but it's quite a good fight for Cruz's progression and his career. I mean, of course, Andy Cruz, he's a Cuban standout. Cuban standout amateur, won a gold medal against Keyshawn Davis in the Tokyo Olympics. So this guy, a lot of people are hyping him up as the real deal. And in his debut, I know he fought Juan Carlos Burgos, who's not been stopped before, but he's a good benchmark for any kind of guy coming up. So to fight him on his debut was quite a good choice for Matchroom to give him. Well, I say quite a good choice. It was quite a good choice in the sense that we've got a measure of how he's going to do as a pro early on, because that's what Burgos is. He is a guy who will give you rounds, but at the same time, you're not going to get an emphatic knockout. Um, yeah, you're not going to get an emphatic knockout against a guy like Juan Carlos Burgos. Thea says, didn't Moran get slumped cold by Haney? Yeah, that's actually really funny. He did. And that's really quite a weird one because he, apart from that single fight, which is really weird to think that he got slumped out cold by a guy like Haney, but and that was a beautiful knockout as well. But it's really weird to think about that with him because in every other fight he's had, apart from that, he's been really durable. He's gone the distance. Haney was the only guy to stop him, and I mean, of course, Cruz is very skilled. He could stop, but Moran, but yeah, that's really quite a shocker. That. Um, because it's something I realised as well when I was going through his record. I recognised it a couple of months ago because he actually fought Moran fought Jermaine Ortiz and gave him a pretty good fight. Who of course we know Jermaine Ortiz as being the guy that probably should have gotten the nod against Tiafimo. Um, so and he buzzed Ortiz a couple of times in that fight. He gave a pretty good effort. So it yeah, no, it's a really strange one that, but yeah, no. Um, but yeah, no, I like this fight in terms of progression for Andy Cruz. It's a good matchup because I mean, apart from that fight as we mentioned, Moran's typically durable. Um, and he does give some back, even though it's not the best quality work. He does give a good effort in return. I mean, I remember watching him on the Pro Box card. I can't remember if he was headlining or co-headlining, but he was fighting Romero Duno, who fought Ryan Garcia and Frank Martin, and he won that fight fairly handily, won fairly easily. So no, he's always going to give everything he can to a prospect, but I don't expect him giving much effort. If I had to pick between the two, I would probably see Andy Cruz getting a probably unanimous decision shutout. Maybe we could see a stoppage, but I don't think it'd be a stoppage, which sounds really weird to say considering he got knocked out cold by Haney, but I don't think it'd be a kind of stoppage where he got knocked out cold flatlines. I think if Moran's going to get stops in this fight, it would be via accumulation, an accumulation of shots. So, yeah, that's that fight. I probably went into more detail than I thought I was going, but Cruz is quite a talented guy coming up, so it's a good fight for him to have at this stage of his career. So what should we go on to next? I would say, while we're on the subject of Cuban standouts, let's go on to the subject of probably one of my favourite fighters at the moment, David Morrell. So this is going to be quite a career-defining fight for him. Not in the sense necessarily of the opponent, although Hot Rod is a solid opponent for him, but in the sense that this fight is going to be for a secondary belt at 175, which is going to, give him more of a talking point at the weight, especially when you've got guys up there like Benavidez, who have just moved up as well. So this is going to be his first fight at 175 as well, and he faces Hot Rod Kalajic. I can't pronounce that, but it's a good fight for his progression. Of course, first at 75, Kalajic is a very seasoned fighter at the weight. Of course, he has a title shot against Beterbiev. He didn't necessarily disgrace himself in that fight. He went a couple of rounds. But as Beterbiev always does, he finds you down, breaks you down, gets the finish. And it was no different in that fight. I think his other loss was to Marcus Brown. That was quite a controversial one, as I remember. But that was absolutely years back, sir. But yeah, he's got a good record on paper, Kalajic. 29-2, I think, which is pretty good record. But he's a pretty basic fighter as well. He does have some good fundamentals, but it's very, you get what you see with Kalajic. Of course, we saw him fight on Pro Box against Mickey Ellison, but that was a very indiscreet fight. Mickey Ellison, it's nothing of note really, but he got the win, got the stoppage in that, and kind of, as we've seen with a lot of guys in Pro Box, they fight in Pro Box and then they get a big opportunity afterwards, which it's good to see. So Morrell, let's go back to Morrell. Very exciting. And Vias just saying, I want to see Morrell versus Benavidez if they both remain 175. And I completely agree. I think that's the fight to make. I think Benavidez should probably get his shot at Undisputed first, provided that goes ahead, no freak injuries or anything this time in October. He should get the winner of that right after, in my opinion, because he beat the third best guy in Vosdik. And then after that, he should fight. Him and Morrell should get it on, in my opinion. So if Morrell gets a defense or two of the secondary belt that he's got, and then I don't see why they can't make that one happen. Personally, I think you might agree with me here, but I'd probably favour Morrell in that fight. But it's hard to make judgments. But that's the fight I'd like to see, and I think that's why it's wise that he's getting this fight at the secondary belt, because he is putting that in this place. Because He's fighting for the WBA regular in this fight, and of course the WBA super champion is Bivol. So actually, even if that undisputed fight doesn't happen, he's going to be likely in line for a shot at Bivol, which would also be a very exciting fight. But I expect him to kind of. I think Kalajic will give him his all, but Kalajic, yeah, it's very basic fight. I'd expect him. Probably, maybe the first few rounds will be slow, but Morel started pretty fast in some of his fights. I wouldn't necessarily call him your typical Cuban boxer. He's, got a lot more offensive approach in some ways. Then, while he's defensively solid, he's got a good offensive approach, which makes him pretty exciting. I think when I first noticed him coming onto the scene, it was in the second fight, and I think that was his only fight to go the distance. But I've kept an eye on him ever since then. And Thea says, it depends how Morel performs tonight, but I do think he may have a better gas than David. Yeah, I think that was really interesting, that last Benavidez fight, because that's one of the only times where we've seen him gas out, really. Obviously, he wasn't completely out of it or anything. He wasn't, going into submission, but it showed a side of him that we hadn't seen before, which the weight probably impacts of that going up in the weight. I don't know how well he moved up to there. I mean, he got a win over a very, very solid fighter, but he didn't seem to have the damage, the impacts that he usually does. I mean, he isn't typically known for being a one-punch power puncher, but didn't seem to be able to get the same kind of respect with his punches that time. But yeah, no, I'm going to go for a Morel stoppage in this fight. I don't know if he'll do it as quick as Benavidez. No, but not Benavidez, Beterbiev. But Kalajic, I think, is going to look a bit like a sitting duck in there, and I think Morel's going to get him out of there, especially with Kalajic's kind of style. He's, doesn't hold back. And Thea says, Vostok didn't do much. I think he came for the chat personally. Yeah, I tend to agree with that. But at the same time, I think we've seen that with people against Benavidez before, and he's still been able to get their respect and get them out of there. So I agree with you, but I also think part of it is we did see something new out of him moving up, and did see a chink in the armor, perhaps. So yeah, I mean, you make a good point. And what fight should we go on to next? So let's say go on to the second of the cruisers on this card. Of course, Isaac Pitbull Cruz, who is facing off against Jose Valenzuela, all Mexican affair. So, I mean, what can go wrong with an all Mexican affair? It's a bit of a weird fight from a promotion standpoint, but I'm not against it. It's probably going to be a pretty entertaining fight, but I'm not the biggest fan of Pitbull Cruz compared to some people, but I only really see this fight going one way. Now, Valenzuela, of course, he came onto the scene as a hard punching prospect. He was getting a lot of KOs. Very exciting. And of course, he's part of that whole Benavidez camp. So he's been sparring Benavidez, I think, Jose Benavidez. So, yeah. I mean, from what I remember, he had all those knockouts, kind of had that momentum in his career, and then he ran into Edwin De Los Santos, which is where Edwin kind of made his name, and dropped Edwin, but kind of rushed in, got caught himself, and never recovered. So that was quite a setback for him. And then, of course, he had the controversial loss to Chris Colbert. And then I believe the last time out or the time before that, I think it might have been last time out, he avenged that loss to Colbert by a brutal KO. So it's been a really weird career for Valenzuela. I mean, he's still only very young, but he's basically had like a half a career already. So, I mean, that's the kind of thing about these. Well, I don't know if I'd define Valenzuela as particularly Mexican style, but these kind of aggressive style fighters, you put your life on the line and it impacts your career in the end. But um, Isaac Cruz, of course, had the stoppage win against Rolly Romero last time out to win the super lightweight title, WBA. Um, there's not much else to say about that win. It was a very straightforward one. He broke Rolly down, and Rolly basically had nothing for him. He was a sitting duck, and Cruz beat him from pillar to post, stopped him. Let's see what Fierce said. He's saying this is his most anticipated one, and yeah, it's nice to see Matcher and PBC and Top Rank all working together. And he says, I think he thinks Cruz is going to get it done, but Valenzuela will do better than Rolly. Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think nearly anyone would do better than Rolly. The fight that always seems like an asterisk for me when it comes to talking about Pitbull Cruz is that one with Giovanni Cabrera. Because while I thought Cruz clearly won that fight, he got a lot of his flaws got exposed in the fight, maybe even more than the Tank fight. It was a really weird fight to watch, that fight. But I don't think Valenzuela particularly has the assets that Cabrera had in that fight. So I see Cruz getting the win in this one. I'm debating whether it's going to be stoppage or points. I think I don't think he's a harder hitter than Edwin Cruz. I think he does have good power. I think he probably has decent one-punch power. It's hard to say because the only guys he's knocked up cold were Gamboa and that featherweight. So it's quite hard to tell on that front. But I'm going to say Pitbull Cruz, and I'm going to say a later stoppage. The reason I say a later stoppage is because, of course, we're used to seeing Valenzuela fight at 135, so that's a factor as well. I don't know how he's going to adjust to that. So that's the reason I'm going to say late stoppage, but I wouldn't be surprised. I wouldn't bet on that. I would say if you're going to bet on anything, bet on points, but I'm going to go with the late stoppage in this fight. But no, it should be an entertaining fight. I'd imagine with those styles, I'd be very surprised if it wasn't entertaining, unless one of them decided to run for the whole fight or something. Felix says Cruz is a bit overrated. Yeah, no, I agree. I don't know whether it was an off night, but that Cabrera fight was atrocious. I don't know what happened there. I mean, the Cabrera style, he struggled a lot with that. But that was that was a really weird fight. Trying to think, are there any more fights before I go on to Ruiz and Miller? I think it's that up next. Yeah, Andy Ruiz and Gerard Miller. I mean, what's there to say about Andy Ruiz? What a waste of career. Well, I say what a waste of. Oh yeah, good point. Yeah, you're right. Jared Anderson versus Piccoli. I can't believe I forgot that one because that's a really exciting fight. That might even be my favourite on the card. So I can't believe I forgot that. Maybe I think it's like some separate card or something. But no, I'm really excited about that. Of course, Jared Anderson coming up the ranks. Both coming up the ranks in a sense because very early on to Mike Hunter. So he hadn't even reached the kind of world stage yet at that point, I would argue. And Jared Anderson, yeah, this is a really interesting fight because you've got a guy who is fighting a guy who's probably his best test, in Jared Anderson. And then you've got a guy in Bacoli who's probably, although he's had those good wins against, say, Tony Oka and Carlos Takam, this is probably going to be his biggest test since since the Hunter fight. So this is a really interesting fight because both guys, despite on paper being in very different situations, they are in pretty similar situations because I don't think that Bacoli's in the stage yet where you would call him a seasoned vet. I still think he's fairly moderately in his career. I mean, fight-wise, they're pretty similar, but you can't really compare the opposition because, of course, Bacoli has those wins over Yoka and Takam. I mean, the Yoka fight was amazing. I remember watching that fight live when it was on, and yeah, Bacoli dropped him twice, basically bullied Joker around the ring, and Olympic gold medalist. And they tried to rob him on the scorecards, but they couldn't because it was such a dominant effort from him. But I do have a few concerns about both. My concern about Jared Anderson, we saw against Riyad Murhi, is sometimes he doesn't have that instinct. And if a guy, I don't think it'll be an issue for him in this fight, but if a guy is, say, if he's a heavy favourite in a fight, then he's got a tendency to not look as good. So that's a factor to consider in this fight. I think a lot of prospects are like that, though. But something to consider. And I've got a concern with Bacoli as well, which is his gas tank. Because even in the Yoka fight, he gassed like. Now, this one I was interested seeing the weigh-ins for because Bacoli's very variable at the weigh-ins. I think Bacoli came in the 280s. I would have liked to see him lighter for this fight because there's a good chance it might go to the later rounds and it could be crucial in the fight outcome. So that's potentially swayed my pick a little bit in this fight, although I still have the same guy. My other concern with Anderson, but I guess it could be a thing for both, is probably defense. Anderson, on paper, I think he looks very slick, but we've seen him get burst by Charles Martin, for instance. I walk this earth like a god. And don't get me wrong, Martin's fairly capable, but if he gets buzzed like that against Bacoli, then it could be very different. Although I think Bacoli's better than Martin, I do think his punches are slower and more cumbersome. So that's another factor to consider. And there's no doubt Anderson's good, but I've not been impressed by him like other people have. But he is good. But I'm going to go with him in this fight. I'm going to predict him to win this fight. I think I'm going to make a bold statement, but I think he could stop Bacoli late, or it goes to points. I'm going to go with Anderson on points. I think either guy, they've got a thing. We haven't seen it as much, but because both guys have been on top. But when one of them, isn't on top in the fight, they seem to kind of fold. They seem to lose the mentality in the fight, and that's going to be an interesting factor to see in this fight. But of course, it's the first of the two heavyweight fights on this card. So potentially they're trying to set up the winners, which I wouldn't mind seeing, and even the losers. I mean, who knows? These are all good fighters, and then of course we've got the co-main event. Well, I don't know if it's the co-main event because I'm just doing the orders in random. But we've got Andy Ruiz, and I mean, of course, as I was saying earlier, before I realised I missed out a fight. I mean, what's to say about Ruiz? It's what a waste of career. Which is quite funny to say because, of course, he's been a unified world champion, but you know, all the time that he's lost from, all the stuff, well, it's basically eaten. So we basically got, and I don't want to disrespect these guys because, anyone that puts their self into the ring deserves respect. But we've basically got a Snickers addict against a pharmacy on legs. So I quite like this fight for a couple of reasons, which is quite weird to say. But not enough people are talking about the inactivity with Ruiz and how that impacts his style. Because obviously he's a very speedy fighter, kind of counter-puncher, reflex-based. And also the weight's going to have an impact on that. So, of course, last time out was around like 2 years ago now. So, bloody ages, especially for heavyweight boxing. And that was against Luis Ortiz, and he dropped Ortiz like 3 times, but he couldn't get the stoppage in that fight. And of course, prior to that against Ariola, he got dropped, and those are the only 2 fights he's had since the rematch in late 2019. So it's not exactly been the cherry on the top, is it? And between that, he's had troubles with, I think he had issues with his wife and stuff like that. And that's not going to put you in the right mindset for fighting, that kind of thing. So I think, if we saw the best version of Ruiz, this fight wouldn't be interesting, but it is interesting because of that. First saying, yeah, it's been really inactive, and so you're picking Miller. And Andy looked very poor against Ortiz. Yeah, exactly. Despite the white cards and knockdowns, he had a very poor showing in both of those fights. And he actually, in those fights, I believe he had a shorter layoff than he has it before this fight. And Miller, even though he lost to Dubois, did all right. Yeah, that's exactly spot on as well. Yeah, and let's talk about Miller. I mean, of course, last time out after. Well, it's a very complex career for Miller because he was looking like, at the very start of career, he was gaining a lot of steam, a lot of traction. And then he came up to the Joshua fight and tested positive for performance enhancing drugs, which he has done a couple of times, which has put his career until recently. That's another reason why this fight is interesting, because obviously the fact that Joshua in 2019 was originally meant to be fighting Miller, and then of course Andy stepped in as the replacement. So that's quite an interesting narrative that you've got these guys fighting now, which is one thing I don't think a lot of people are thinking about for this fight. But yeah, obviously Miller popped for that fight, and then popped again. And then he came back, had a few fights, and then fought Lucas Brown, which was a pretty good fight, but it was against like a 43-year-old Lucas Brown. Got the stoppage in that fight, and then went on to Saudi, got Saudi money, so basically a second chance at his career, and fought Dubois. Of course, there was I was watching it the other day, there was a very symbolic moment from the press conference where Dubois was saying, every baby has a daddy. and I'm gonna make you my son or something like that. I'm not quoting it correctly, but that was really hilarious. So that was quite exciting. And of course, Miller had some verbals with Joshua in that press conference as well. So he adds the entertainment value. I mean, we haven't seen it as much in this build up because they're both very respectful to each other. I think they go back a long way. But I do it, there's no denying he's entertainment, and that's probably why he got the payday again. But lost to Dubois, but um, stoppage in the final few seconds. But I don't think it's stoppage that's going to permanently damage him or anything. He wasn't permanently out cold. It was good stoppage by the ref. And he seems to have rebounded pretty well. I mean, against Dubois, he was massive. He was absolutely massive. He was like a whale or something like that. That's the only way I can describe it. I know it's a bit disrespectful, but he was absolutely massive. And he did ask some questions of Dubois early on in that fight, but eventually just gassed out, and Dubois took over. But I mean, that lost his age fairly well. Looking at the Dubois versus Hrgovic fight, so um, £333 of American burgers and ice cream. Cheers. Yeah. Now I thought, for this fight, I deliberately wanted to wait to talk about this fight after the weigh-in, and I'm glad I did, because two very different stories at the weigh-in. Ruiz looks terrible in the weigh-in. Not the worst, but that's not saying much about Ruiz because he's looked like an absolute tub of lard at times. But no, he didn't look good in that weigh-in, not at all. And on the other hand, Miller looks basically unrecognisable to how he looked in the Dubois way, and he's much less fleshy. You can see more muscle on him, and for me, this fight just got really interesting because you've got two guys on basically the other end of the spectrum. One guy who's considerably slimmed down, and one guy who's basically regressed into a fatter version of himself. I mean, it's always hard to tell with Ruiz at weigh-ins because he sucks in the gut, sucks in the belly, and you don't really get the true view until fight night. But no, it's a really interesting fight. Wow, I didn't actually know that. He weighed more for this fight than his entire career. That is crazy, and that's a really concerning statistic. Now, I'm probably really going to surprise you in this. Just after how much I've been trashing Ruiz, I'm actually still going to pick him in this fight. I just think that he'll be able to do enough to get it done, and he will see a lot of Miller shots coming probably. But I wouldn't make that a confident pick after all these other factors that he's had. But I'm going to pick him in this fight, and I'm going to pick him by a decision. I think what will be interesting about the fight is what happens in these later rounds because of Miller being in this better condition. Whether that his cardio will carry into later rounds and he can make a good fight through Ruiz, because it's going to be an entertaining fight. I can guarantee that. If I can't guarantee anything else, it's going to be a great fight. I think this one. But no, it's definitely an interesting one. And I can see your reasons for picking Miller in this one. You've probably got more reasons to pick Miller in this fight than Ruiz now, especially after that weigh-in. And yeah, so I guess that brings us to our main event. And I'm probably going to have a very controversial talk about this main event. Um, but it's very well. It's certainly quite an interesting main event because we've got Terence Crawford. He's like what 37, 38 now, and he's moving up to a higher weight class, which is not something you usually see from an older champion. Um, he's moving up to fight the newly crowned WBA champion, 29-year-old Israel Madrimov. And I've seen a lot of comparisons. I wouldn't make this comparison myself between Madrimov and Triple G. I don't know whether it's just because of how they look. Um, but I mean, I've watched a lot of Triple G fights, and I've watched most of Madrimov's career. I wouldn't make that comparison in terms of style, at least. So it's probably just aesthetics. Um, so yeah, I mean, it's a weird fight in the sense that Madrimov is 10-0, 10-0 and 1, with the one draw being like a draw to Michelle Sorrow in the rematch. Um, but it'll be interesting to see how much of a factor the weight plays. Um, I mean, momentum's going to be a big factor. Both have got momentum, but it's undoubtedly that Crawford's got the bigger momentum coming off that career-defining win against Errol Spence. But I think that was nearly a year ago, or even over a year ago, because I remember watching it, and it was the same day that Gaethje vs Poirier 2 was on. Um, now, Madrimov last time out he beat Kurbanov, um, Magomed Kurbanov, and his notable wins are probably Michel Sorrow. He had a very respectable debut actually against Vladimir Hernandez, which I didn't realise until today that was his debut fight. Which, if you know Vladimir Hernandez, is a very dangerous fight for anyone at that weight. So that's quite a respectable debut. Um, now it's a weird one because Uh, obviously, I mean, I don't personally have him as my pound for pound number one, but I could see why many can easily make a case for him being pound for pound number one. But I've never, until that last fight against Spence, I'd never really been particularly impressed. And that's probably quite one thing for me to say from sitting in a sedentary position. But no, it's not. I've never really been impressed, even against say Porter, even though we got stopped. It 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 was something about him. I just didn't impress, and I think I know what it was. It was that prior to that Spence fight, his punches they're much wider and much ungainly, and it seems like for that Spence fight, he practiced making his punches more more tight and more close, and maybe that's something that he knew he'd had success with against um, Errol, and that's probably why I had never grown warm on Crawford until now, really, because of that, wide punch he used to have. I mean, look at the knockout against Jose Benavidez. Um, really strange knockout, but really good knockout. Um, but yeah, that's one thing I noticed is he's really sharpened up his punches. He's sharpened it up for that fight. Um, yeah, I agree with you. It's a shame that he had that long layoff after the fight because he did lose a lot of momentum. Um, but a lot of people are still raving about him, so that's good that he's had that breakthrough, even though it's been this late on in his career. Um, because people are speaking about him because of how great he is at the moment. People are speaking about him like he's not in his late 30s or anything. Um, but just goes to show. Um, Now, I didn't actually watch away in for this specific fight, so I didn't see how they looked. But I know prior to it, Crawford was looking pretty big. So it'll be interesting to see how they look next to each other on the scales. Because Madrimov isn't the biggest 154 pounder, but he's pretty big. Um, So that would be interesting. Of course, Crawford combined the two stances. Madrimov's very much conventional boxer, but very good at what he does, very polished at the fundamentals. I remember watching him on the Uzbekistan cards a couple of years back, which was being headlined by MJ Akhmadaliev. Um, and he put on a pretty good performance in that fight. So, yeah, I'm very familiar with both of them. But, alright, see you, Fierce. Have fun. But yeah, no, I agree with it because yeah, definitely. Yeah, no, I agree with you. I think Crawford is a great fight, but don't get me wrong, I find that unbelievable. Yeah, I don't understand how people expect him to beat Canelo because we've already seen with a Canelo fight, there's weight classes for a reason, and some people just like to forget that fight and make their mythical matchups based on what they want to happen. Um, but yeah, no, this fight, I'm actually going to disagree with you on this fight, though, because you give Madrimov more of a chance than many do. And while I definitely rate Madrimov, and I'd probably rate him as maybe the second best super welterweight prior to Crawford moving up, maybe behind Tim Tszyu, um, I think I'm going to pick Crawford in a fairly straightforward fight. Now, don't get me wrong, the way he beat Spence from pillar to post, I imagine it'll be more competitive than that fight. But I expect it to be fairly straightforward for Crawford in this fight. I think the early few rounds might be competitive, but I think as it goes on, provided he hasn't aged overnight, I just think Crawford will find his range, and I think he'll find the jab, and he'll keep firing down the middle and keep setting up traps. And Madrimov, being the conventional fighter he is, while he's very good at being conventional, I think he's going to struggle with that unconventional element of his style. And that's going to play out to be the story of the fight. And I think, well, as you know, I don't think it's going to be a similar fight to Postal, but a similar idea of how the fight was, because Postal was similar in the sense that he was very conventional, very good um, at the basics. But I agree. Yeah, no, I don't think it'll be an early stoppage by any means. I'd probably agree with whereabouts you say, like round 7 or 8, maybe a bit later, because of the moving up in weight. But I do expect it to be fairly straightforward, to be honest. But I could end up eating my words tomorrow morning, so we'll see. Um, but I'll probably wrap it up here because I think I broke them all down. Um, so I hope everyone that tuned in enjoyed the stream. There is currently an event on Sky Sports, but um, I think this is the big event of the night that's on tonight. So yeah, see you guys sometime soon.